It was the case that captured the nation, a seemingly all-American couple accused of espionage during the height of the anti-communist McCarthy era. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg fight to clear their names became the trial of the century, and their fate made history. Their death sentence was also the most infamous decision of an ambitious federal court judge eyeing his place in history and the subject of a new book, Judgment and Mercy.
Dateline Sing Sing, June 19, 1953.
It was the first high-profile espionage case of the Cold War. A married couple accused of spying for the Soviet Union by providing top-secret information on the atomic bomb. Once convicted, the fates of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were in the hands of Second Circuit federal court judge Irving R. Kaufman.
I think he viewed their betrayal not just as a betrayal of the United States, but almost as a personal betrayal of him.
It took author Martin Siegel 30 years to pen Judgment and Mercy, driven by his need to understand a man he clerked for as a Harvard law graduate.
I wanted people to have a more complete and kind of nuanced understanding of this long and important career that goes beyond simply the Rosenberg case.
A career that spanned more than 5 decades, and oddly enough, a reversal in ideology, but Siegel says never in personality.
What was he like?
He was famous for being a difficult boss.
Cantankerous?
Cantankerous, a yeller, would humiliate and embarrass law clerks. No work was ever good enough.
But in 1992, 6 months into Siegel's clerkship, Kaufman died of pancreatic cancer.
The rabbi was up there in the middle of a eulogy, and a man stood up behind me and yelled, "He murdered the Rosenbergs, let him rot in hell." I was just astonished in 1992 that people still cared enough to show up and disrupt and infiltrate his funeral. I couldn't believe it, and that's what started me thinking about this guy would be a fascinating subject for a book.
Born in Brooklyn, New York in 1910, Kaufman was the child of Jewish immigrants, growing up in tenements on the Lower East Side.
He seemed to be fighting his roots.
Yeah, in some ways he seemed almost embarrassed by them. He had this rags to riches upbringing. He seemed to want the world to think that he'd always been on Park Avenue, where he ended up.
His meteoric rise began in 1931 after graduating from Fordham Law School at the tender age of 21.
He was called the Demon Boy prosecutor, as this kind of famous lawyer in the city handling major cases in his 20s. He's appointed a federal judge in 1939, and he's the second youngest in America.
According to Siegel, he was meticulous, calculating every move as a prosecutor to get assigned high-profile cases by courting influential people.
We of the FBI feel that we're a part of a team.
Power brokers like the nation's infamous FBI chief, J. Edgar Hoover.
This is a lot of correspondence between Judge Kaufman and J. Edgar Hoover.
But this is like 49.
This is 49, but this is when Judge Kaufman is jockeying for an appointment to the United States District Court. I merely say amen to all the tributes that are being paid to you. In my opinion, you are the greatest public servant of our time. So that's the kind of typical flattery that streamed pretty constantly from New York down to Washington.
He even got his family in on the act.
One of his sons wrote a letter which says, "Dear Mr. Hoover, are you having a nice time in Washington? We are having a nice time in camp."
So this is from one of his children?
Yeah, this is one of his children.
Oh my goodness. And that is taking brown-nosing to a whole new level.
That's the full court family press is what's going on there.
All with one goal in mind, he says, to reach the United States Supreme Court.
High-profile cases just seem to keep landing in his lap.
Yeah, that wasn't an accident. He knew how to work the system. He knew how to get those cases.
Kaufman lobbied to get assigned to the Rosenberg trial and got his slot thanks to a junior prosecutor on the case by the name of Roy Cohn, known as an architect of McCarthy's Red Scare.
It does sometimes seem as if Judge Kaufman went into that trial persuaded of their guilt. And that's almost jumps off the page when you read the transcript, because he's constantly intervening in the questioning, almost always to help the prosecution. So he gave himself a week between the end of the trial until pronouncing sentence to mull it. And he came back with the death sentences for both.
he sentenced both Rosenbergs to death in the electric chair.
His decision, while popular in the moment, would later backfire, with calls for his resignation in the 1970s, even a rebuke by a sitting Supreme Court justice.
Justice Frankfurt actually vowed to stay on the Supreme Court long enough so that Judge Kaufman would be too old to replace him. That's how personal Justice Frankfurter took it. The criticism he was subjected to for decades over the Rosenberg case.
The irony? His rulings after the Rosenberg trial were consequential. A 1961 school desegregation case in New Rochelle, New York, was the first in the North.
So he had no patience at all for any kind of defense of segregation or for the message that came to African Americans there, which was, as it was around the country, just wait.
Be patient.
Be patient. We'll eventually get around to this. We'll build a new school. We'll fix it. He ordered them to integrate then and there.
I wanted to see Grand Canyon and all the other things.
An immigration trial featuring the Beatles' very own John Lennon.
So the John Lennon case was an attempt by the Nixon administration to basically retaliate against Lennon for his political activities, anti-war activity.
That seemed an almost about face of his intentions earlier on in his career.
Yeah, I think he always kind of sided with the immigrant.
What do we need? Revolution! When? Now!
And cases concerning the Vietnam War.
Probably the most important had to do with the draft and conscientious objection. And he issued a decision holding that you could be a conscientious objector and exempt from service, not just on the basis of religious belief, but also on the basis of moral objection.
You've just been vindicated.
That ruling helped lay the groundwork for the Supreme Court reversal of Muhammad Ali's draft conviction, a win that allowed the boxer's comeback.
When we think about those decisions, they're fundamental to how we see America today.
He's at the forefront of these critical civil liberties issues that are percolating up in the Vietnam era, in the civil rights era, and then into the 1970s and 80s. And he sort of has his fingerprints all over these important controversies that they're still raging today.
Yeah, he definitely had a legacy. Obviously, never made it to the Supreme Court of the United States, but Ronald Reagan did award him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So, you know, accent marks, quotation marks all over his career in terms of highs and lows. Fascinating character.
I like
Really
his kids writing to,
I know.
to Hoover with something.
That is, you said that very diplomatically, the ultimate in brown nose.
Yeah.